Hello again, folks. It's Mike McDonald from Sea Eagle Aviation, and I've got another video for you today. A beautiful Sunday in April in Canada. This is a continuing in the series or the playlist of the PGIs, Preparatory Ground Instruction. You remember from my last one, I described the PGI as a lesson that's done on a whiteboard or a computer prior to the flight that the student should have studied the night before. And then we go through the lesson, what to expect, and then we fly the lesson. So it's preparatory ground instruction to prepare for the lesson. Today's lesson is straight and level flight. The previous one would have been attitudes and movements, which is the first real flying lesson. And the purpose of this lesson is to build on that foundational skill. Okay, so we'll just get this up on the whiteboard. I have my notes here. There we go. Give it a second here to kick in. There we go. I'm up in the corner where I should be. Straight and level flight, preparatory ground instruction. The objective to fly straight and level at different speeds on a heading. The what? To fly on a specific heading, straight and level at normal cruise flight, slower than normal cruise flight, and faster than normal cruise flight. What will the skills that will be gained during this lesson and subsequent lessons, because there's a lot of straight and level flying going on in flying, it reinforces attitude familiarity. Remember attitudes and movement, right? So in this case, we're talking about pitch attitude and bank attitude. Bank attitude to stay on a constant heading. Pitch attitude, as you will see, affects the speed of the airplane. Okay. It also helps reinforce the control feelings, and we really start talking about the trim for the first time now with this lesson. So you'll learn the basic necessary skills for the most common mode of flight, cruise. And we'll also talk about separation for traffic, and we will create precise speed control for the student to use during their subsequent lessons and their flying career. So usually at the beginning of this lesson, and this may be the first time the student has heard about this, there is an equation that we use in flying, and it's called attitude and power equals performance. I like to describe it this way. Imagine that the airplane is a piece of hardware, like a computer. A computer, with no software in it, just the nuts and bolts. But then we add the operating system in. Some people use Microsoft, some people use Apple. Phones have operating systems, all the computers have operating systems. They're very complicated, reams and reams and reams of code. But in this case, it's only one line of code that this computer, the airplane, runs off of. And that code is an equation. And the equation has variables, okay? And so the equation is attitude plus the power setting equals performance. It'll perform somehow, okay? So you have the equations, attitude, and power, and then the result is the performance. So the computer or the airplane will then perform a certain way. Right? And so you will find in this lesson that you'll really start to get an idea of what we mean by attitude plus power equals performance. It's pretty fascinating because we'll be playing with attitudes and power settings. In the previous lesson, the attitudes and movements, typically the instructor does not talk much about power. They silently manipulate the power during that lesson. But this is the first time that the student's really going to get a sense of what to do with power settings on the computers. Okay, so we usually have what's called a threshold knowledge test for the student, see whether they studied well, see if there's any holes in their knowledge. So we ask a couple of questions. Like, for example, what speeds do the aircraft cruise at? Well, it depends on the airplane, but generally all GA airplanes cruise roughly at the same speed, especially the trainers, right? I don't mean all GA airplanes, trainers, all right? Like the Cessna 172, the Piper Cherokee, the Aero, the Cessna 150. They have a range of speeds that they generally fly at, okay? Especially the trainers, okay? So where would you find that information? I'll give you 2 seconds. Yeah, you could Google it, but no, the pilot operating handbook. All the information, how to operate that airplane, is in the aircraft flight manual also known as the Pilot Operating Handbook. So one would hope that the student would be sort of flipping through the Pilot Operating Handbook. They can do like Reader's Digest, put it in the bathroom, read it every time they go to the bathroom, and they'll get to know the POH and the parameters of the aircraft. All right. And so the other question is, what are the parameters that must be managed in various speeds of straight and level flight? Want a hint? We just talked about it. Nose attitude and power settings. Okay, attitude plus power equals performance. Okay, so we'll look at the how, right? So let's talk about the lookout. Now, here's the thing. We're all used to driving cars, and you can generally predict where another car is going to come from, in front of you, to the left, or to the right if you're in England or Australia, various places in the world, right? To the left and to the right at intersections. But with aviation, which is in three-dimensional space, something can come at you from anywhere. And it might not necessarily be another vehicle. It could be a bird. It could be a cloud that you accidentally fly into. It could be other traffic. You get the picture. And so we need to have a strategy to be able to spot traffic. And I found that the best thing to do in terms of a strategy to spot traffic is to, let's just talk about the front windshield to begin with, is to divide the front windshield into segments, 3 segments, 2, 3. All right, so section 1, 2, and 3. Scan each segment independently, back and forth. Get into the habit of scanning each segment. And the question would come up, well, why can't I just look out the window and see an object? Well, yeah, you could potentially, and it does happen. But the strategy of scanning in segments is really good because you may not realize it, especially if you're in a car, because not very often do you have a vehicle converging directly towards you. The phenomena that occurs when an object is coming straight at you in 3-dimensional space is there's very little lateral or vertical movement. As a matter of fact, the less there is, the more insidious it is. What happens is the tiny dot gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And by the time you notice it, it may be too late to get out of the way. Okay. So anything that converges upon you is not going to trigger you with left or right or up and down motions that catches your eye. Okay. So you're kind of like an alligator. Unless it moves, you don't see it. Slowly going bigger and bigger and bigger, and then maybe too late. Okay. And things happen quick in an airplane. So we divide the windscreen into segments, as well as looking at the left and the right window, to catch that before it gets out of hand. So we talk about that. And also, it's part of emphasizing attitude flying, looking out the window, getting your eyes off the instruments, all right, getting them out the window, and then cross-checking the instruments. Remember, it's 70% out the window, 30% on the instruments that you want to spend looking, okay? So just move this out of the way here. So in this exercise, we would set cruise power, say 2,200 RPM, in a Cessna 172. That's going to get you 95 knots, roughly, most times of the year. And we want to, I might as well just switch right over to the flight simulator. There we go. So this airplane right here is going 90 knots, okay? 90 knots. It's on a heading of 180 degrees. It's at 3,000 feet, and it's not climbing or descending, right? So it's basically just flying along straight and level flight, which is what we want to talk about, all right? Now, you may remember if you had seen the previous PGI that I did, that I talked about how do you know by looking at the window whether you're in the proper nose attitude, up or down, for cruise flight with standard power setting. And that is to put your hand on the dashboard, and then at the top of the 4th finger should be the horizon. So that would be between the dashboard here and the horizon here. Okay, so let's imagine that's 4-finger. I call it 4-finger cruise. Okay, I'm just going to make a little adjustment here on the, okay, so I'm just making sure that the computer is not going to start to stutter and freeze. Running a lot of stuff on my laptop here. Okay, so here we go. So this is the forefinger from the dash to the horizon, okay? You'll also notice that on the attitude indicator, all right, on the attitude indicator, the level line or the nose line is right more or less on the horizon, okay? Slightly above the horizon between the brown ground and the blue sky. And you can see the airspeed is at 90 knots, 3,000 feet. All right, so what do you think is going to happen when we want to, say, slow the airplane down? Now we're going to be making use of that equation, attitude plus power. And that doesn't necessarily mean add power. It just means attitude and power, different variations of the two, create different types of performance. Okay. What do you think happens when we reduce the power? If you're not touching the control column, the airplane is going to nose down and start to descend because the airplane wants to fly at what we call the trim speed, and I'll get to that in a moment. So we need to, while we reduce the power, to simultaneously adjust the nose attitudes. We're playing with those two variables to get the desired performance, in this case, to slow down. But we're going to slow this airplane down from 90 knots to 65 knots, okay? I'm going to do it with the autopilot here. Saves me from driving this airplane out of control. And so I've just reduced the speed. So in actual fact, what it's done is it's brought the power level way back. Yeah, we're losing a bit of altitude because the pilot here in this autopilot is not quick on the controls. He should be bringing the nose up. And as you can see here, the horizon is less than 4 fingers now, right? As the nose is raised to compensate for the lack of power. And as you can see, the airspeed is now at 65 knots. And the little autopilot pilot here is dealing with things and getting things back in line. So we're at the same altitude. Now, look at that. The horizon is almost touching the dash, okay? And we're doing 65 knots. Now, also note on the attitude indicator that the wing line is now well above the 5-degree mark. So we're in a nose high attitude. Because if we reduce power and we want to keep our altitude, we have no choice but to raise the nose. The act of raising the nose is really what slows the airplane down, okay? The control column is a speed control. The power is an up and down control, all right? And you'll see more and more as you go through flight training how true that is. All right, so here we are, 3,000 feet, 65 knots, slightly nose high attitude. Everything's hunky-dory, all right? So now the instructor would want to bring the airplane back to its original cruise speed, which I believe was 95 knots. So we'll just add some power. And of course, now the nose wants to go up. It wants to climb, and that's what's happening right here. But then the autopilot kicks in and says, no, I know what you're up to. You want to hold your 3,000 feet. So it starts to lower the nose. Starts to lower the nose. And there you can see the nose is getting lower again. And I'm stuttering in the picture because there's a lot of processing going on here. So I'll talk slower and not move around as much. Okay, so now here we are up close to 95 knots, stable at more or less stable at 3,000 feet. And you can see now that the horizon is back to the 4-finger cruise attitude, and the attitude indicator is back on the horizon line. Okay, so we have slowed the airplane down and raised the nose. Slow the airplane down while simultaneously reducing power. Attitude plus power equals performance. All right, and then we brought the power back to its original setting and had no choice but to lower the nose in order to not climb. Attitude plus power equals performance. So now we're going 95 knots at 3,000 feet. Now let's speed her up. Let's go from 95 knots to 110 knots. We're going to add a bunch of power. And of course, the airplane wants to climb. And the slow to the mark autopilot here is letting it climb a little bit before it starts to lower the nose. You'll notice quite an appreciable change in the nose attitude as the speed comes up. That's 110. And you can see that the distance between the horizon and the dashboard is now less. And we're at 110 knots. Let's see if we can make this thing go a little faster. 120. Let's see what we can do here. 120 knots. As we increase our speed to 120 knots, less and less distance between the horizon and the dashboard. And once things settle up here, you can see that, and now really in a real airplane, you might see that this dot on the attitude indicator is slightly below the ground, but mostly I want you to look at the outside, okay? Right? So to recap, in order to increase speed, you increase power. But if you don't change the attitude of the nose, either up or down, say you just add power, the plane is going to climb because the power control is the up and down control, right? If you reduce the power without making any changes in the nose attitude, the nose is going to drop and it's going to descend, okay? So we have to hold the nose for the altitude that we want to stay at, okay? Hold the nose for the altitude that we want to stay at, all right? So that requires making some adjustments in the nose attitude to keep the altitude, 3,000 feet. The only way to make speed changes, well, it's not the only way. You can change the speed and climb and descend once it's a more of an advanced technique. But at this point, we just want to stay level at 3,000 feet and change our speeds. And you want to feel what's going on with the control column and what's going on with the view at the window. All right. So attitude plus power equals performance, right? So the effects of power, right? Slower and faster, right? Reduce power in 100 RPM increments, watch the nose drop. Put back pressure on the control column to maintain altitude. Notice the nose attitude. You can look out at the wings too and see the angles that they are against the horizon. They're going to reflect what you see out the front window. You're going to see the performance change, i.e. the speed change, out the window. You're going to hear it, and you're going to see it on the instrument. Okay? So let's talk about trim. What is trim? Well, a trim tab is very simply a little flap that's on the elevator, okay? So a little flap that's on the elevator. So imagine this is the elevator, right? You want the elevator to move downwards, right? Move downwards, then bring the flap up and the wind will push the elevator downwards. If you want the elevator to move upwards, then bring the flap down and it'll push the elevator upwards. That is accomplished with a trim wheel in the cockpit or sometimes overhead in the cockpit. Remember, I think you understand now that nose attitude and power settings, as long as you hold an altitude, keep the speed, change the speed, right? But why do you want to, you're going to have to hold for maybe an hour that position on the control column? It gets a little bit tiring. So we use the trim to relieve the pressure that you're feeling from the control column, because right now it's out of trim until you trim it. Once you've trimmed the pressure off, for example, if we're speeding up and we need to lower the nose to maintain altitude because we've got more power, then we need to use the trim in the nose down position until that pressure disappears. We can fly hands-free. And then subsequently, if you want to slow the airplane down, you reduce power and raise the nose to hold altitude, right? Well, you do really want to sit there all day holding the, and are you precise enough to hold the altitude all the time with back pressure? No, you trim the nose up a little bit, you'll feel that pressure disappear. As a matter of fact, one of the things I do during this lesson is I take control and I put it wildly at a trim, and I hold it, sometimes quite a lot of pressure. And then I have the student take control, and then as they take control, I release it. And if it's two nose down, the trim is two nose down, they'll feel the control column wanting to snap into the dash, pulling hard, and I mean hard, right? And then I ask the student, okay, you're trimmed two nose down, so I want you to trim the trim nose up until that pressure disappears. And so the student gets to feel how the trim tab works. And then we do the opposite. I'll trim the nose way, 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 way up, but hold it with the control column, literally like with the palms of my hands, transfer control, and then have the student with one hand hold that position while trimming the nose up until that pressure disappears. The trim is everything in flying, everything in flying. And autopilot will not work correctly if an airplane is too wildly out of trim. And believe me, more than one accident has occurred because of this. All right, so trim is everything. Okay, so we've slowed the airplane down, we've gone back to cruise, we sped the airplane up, we've gone back to cruise. And now we know how to use the trim. One of the things about trim that people tend to do in the beginning is they fly by trim. They're whizzing that trim wheel all over the place, not feeling what it's doing. Okay. So the technique is set the nose attitude for whatever it is you want to do speed changes or climbs and descents, and then go to the trim wheel and take the pressure off. Don't fly by trim. It's a bad habit to get into. Okay, so some of the safety factors we talk about before the lesson, and we talk about the lookout and how to properly scan left to right or right to left. Segmented scans, do 1/3, second third, next third, middle third, back, just back and forth. Reinforce that good, healthy, life-saving habit into your regimen. Okay. It says 4 sections here. I think 3 sections is fine. So lookout, but also a listening watch. Now, on the second major flight lesson, you cannot expect the student to understand what's going on in the radio. So that's the instructor's job. A listening watch is with the radios, making sure there's no conflicts, making sure that you're safe for your lesson. Some common errors are chasing altitude. This is very common because early on in the flying experience, a lot of students don't really know what the pressures and the settings are. And so they'll be, and then of course the instructor's like, oh, you got to hold at altitude, which personally I don't think is a great idea in the beginning to overemphasize. Just let the student get used to the controls. And sometimes I'll even ghost a little bit to sort of help things out. But eventually, as they go on, they need to learn to hold an altitude. And it's all done with power and trim. Okay. Rudder control, I don't tend to get into it too much in this lesson, but generally the slower you go, all right, generally the slower you go, the more you're going to need to use some right rudder. All right. The faster you go, the less you're going to need it. And there's lessons coming up, climbing and especially climbing and descending, where we talk about that and it becomes very obvious. Yes, it's true. Rudder coordination is important in cruise flight, but I don't tend to emphasize that too much during that first straight and level flight. Okay. And so that's basically it. I can't see if I missed anything. We slowed the airplane down. We sped it up. Oh yeah, let's just go to the whiteboard here. And there is one thing I'd like to talk about. And that is, let's just emphasize this, all right? The equation, attitude plus, that doesn't mean add, just means m power, equals performance. All right? So fast is nose down, high power. Slow is nose up, low power. Just in roughly speaking, there's all the degradations in between. And so that's an example of attitude plus power equals performance. It also applies to turns, right? A right bank attitude and cruise power gives you a right-hand turn and cruise, right? So the software works, right? But here's a trick, and I do show the students this. If a student is really catching on really quick, I'll throw this into the lesson. If not, I'll do it on a subsequent lesson. It's how you can predict the speeds that you would get for the equation, especially with a GA airplane. Generally, with a Cessna 172 or a PA-28 Cherokee, you can expect this. For each 100 RPM power change, plus or minus, so adding or subtracting, all right, expect 5 knots indicated airspeed change, plus or minus, depends on whether you're speeding up or slowing down. But there's a caveat. You know what it is? As long as you hold the altitude with pitch. Okay? If you hold the altitude with pitch, in other words, trying to keep that airplane with pitch at that altitude, all right? That means that when you're going slower, your pitch will have to be more nose up. When you're going faster, your pitch will have to be more nose down. That's how you find the nose attitude to maintain level and speed the airplane up or slow it down. Okay, so for every 100 RPM power change, and this would be in a non-variable pitch propeller, just a fixed pitch General Trainer, Diamond, Cessna, Piper. For each 100 RPM power change, plus or minus, expect 5 knots indicated airspeed change, plus or minus. Okay, as long as you hold the altitude with pitch, because you're playing with the equation, attitude plus power equals performance. Two things I say the most often throughout the flying training measurement of a student is, hey, remember, attitude plus power equals performance, and also right rudder. We'll get into that later. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I hope you have a great day, and I'll try to squeeze out another video as soon as I can. Have a great day.